Welcome to our lecture on muted group theory. This is the last in our gender section here, and actually last theory for the course as well. And you'll notice that the way that I've structured this gender section is that we've been moving from really least critical to most critical here. So the muted group theory, I think, is going to be the closest version of what we would get to like a critical approach to gender in this class. So it'd be this is a theory that you would most typically associate with like a feminist theory, for example. Now, muted group theory, and Sheris Kramery is our muted group theorist, is based on the presupposition that language is a man-made construction. Now, we've been talking about that for a while, the ways in which language is formed, right? Like semiotic references and reference are fairly arbitrary, right? They're kind of culturally constructed. So in that sense here, right, it is man-made in that it's constructed. But what Kramery points us to look at is the ways in which we can talk about man-made, right? Literally made by men. She says that throughout history, men have predominantly been the people with power. And people with power, as we've talked before, are the people with the ability to name and the ability to make decision. And so what that means is that language is something that has been constructed by men and for men. We've talked about the ways that language is never neutral or value-free. There's always winners and losers. And so Kramery argues that if historically men have been the ones in places of power to write the language, there also means language is written for men as well. They are the winners in the way that it's constructed. A couple examples that are generally used to talk about the ways in which language may be male-based, but we can look at examples like Mr. versus Mrs. Right? Titles of people are, a male's title is not determined by his relationship, whereas a woman's title is. Gender-specific job titles, things like right, firemen, postmen, policemen, that kind of thing. Or non-parallel usage, using things like right, man and wife, for example. Or using you guys to refer to a group of mixed gender. Or gendering objects, another example, right? When we talk about some objects, we tend to make them feminine. So like we talk about like boats, for example, right? She's out to sea or something like that. Right, these are examples that muted group theory points to as and back to that too, right? Like just the idea, objects are generally feminine, and is that correlation there between objects and gender. Women getting kind of languaged as if they are objects themselves. Kramery provides lots of these type of examples. These are just a few of the ways that they point to say that, right, it looks like language might be written in some ways to try to privilege men over women. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that it mutes women in other marginalized groups, other groups that are not represented in the language. It literally silences them. It makes it as if they're invisible. And what that ends up doing is it puts men in privileged positions. Right, language is something that is very powerful. The way that we talk, the way that we construct, if we go back to symbolic interactionism, right, language it makes us who we are. And so she says what ends up happening is, right, our view of the world becomes one in which men are placed in privileged positions. And women are forced to compensate. They're put at a disadvantage in language. And we talked about this a little bit in last theory when we talked about standpoint theory. All right, women have to conform to a male-centered language to be heard. You have to co-opt, or you have to learn to speak like a man if you're going to end up getting anything accomplished. Now, mutedness, the way that she talks about it, is caused by a lack of power. That lack of power is linguistically constituted, right? Women don't have that. So she says that the muted groups become black holes because they're overlooked, muffled, or rendered invisible. They're not present in the language, and so right, they're not there, basically. They can't be addressed. So the problem is, if we go back to our talk about Deborah Tannen and gender lack, right? She says that men and women speak different language. So say if that's true, she says what women have to do is they have to re-encode their thoughts. You have one sort of language, and you have to speak a different kind of language if you're going to be heard. Well, when you speak in your second language, you're never as proficient. You're never as good at doing it. And so it puts women at a disadvantage, argues Kramer. And she points to that example of the public versus private that Tannen does as well, as a way to illustrate this, kind of like we talked about earlier in the previous theory, public versus private, that men's voices or masculine forms of talk are privileged in the public, whereas women's are in the private. And Kramer asks, where do the important things in our society happen? Where are choices made? Where does debate happen? Where's like large scale type of things happening? It's always in the public, and it's almost exclusively masculine driven. She uses the language gatekeepers, right? A gatekeeper is someone who lets someone in and keeps other people out. She says that men do the gatekeeping of language because they're in privileged positions. So, for example, we were talking about public versus private here. If you think about, the type of expressions or communicative modes that we think of as primarily more feminine, things like poetry, art, dialogue, performances, the arts, for example, then she asks, what role do these play in determining public policy, right? Are these the type of modes of dialogue, of communication that get things done? No, they're not, right? What we have is a monologic type of masculine style of communication that happens in the public sphere, which is where things actually happen, right? Where we make decisions on it as a large scale. Now, muted group theory, if you look in your textbook, you'll see the feminist dictionary is something that's used within there as well, and they point to this as a kind of victory. Now, what the feminist dictionary is a kind of tongue-in-cheek look at how language might be if it were written explicitly for women, the way that language is written explicitly for men, argues the theory. Now, some of them are certainly tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but they're there, right? They're not proposing this feminist dictionary as the way to do it, like what should be the dictionary. They're just saying, look, what if we reverse this? We can see how crazy it looks when it's written to privilege one gender over the other when things are turned around. A more substantial victory is out of the muted group theory came the idea of sexual harassment. Around the 70s or so. Before that, there was never a word for that thing, right? What it was, sexual harassment, that creepy feeling women would get being treated certain ways in the workplace. And there was no word for it. And if there's no word for it, right, it means that it can't be addressed. You can't say, stop doing that creepy stuff, for example, right? You can't take legal action on the basis of not having a defined term. And this is an example where they point to, so you see, this is language being written for men by men. Our women's experience are not included within the language, and through a concerted effort, feminists were able to put sexual harassment on the books, right, in the dictionary. And once it's a term, then you can engage it, and then you can actually do things about it. This is a highly interpretive theory, so let's run it through a critique. A new understanding of people. At this point in history, probably not, because most people are familiar with what feminist theory is. But in the 70s or so, when this theory was developed, it was groundbreaking. And so perhaps historically it gave us a new understanding of people. But clarification of values, very high on that, right? Right up front, what they're trying to do is they're trying to let women's voices be heard. So it does a good job in telling us where it comes from. Does it have aesthetic appeal? This one people are usually on the fence with. This is a theory that usually, like the last one, half the class really gets on board with and half the class really doesn't like. So put it through your own aesthetic appeal thing there. Discussion and community of agreement. This cannot be argued with. This is one of the first communication feminist theories out there, and the ball has only continued rolling since. And look at the things that, like how important of a voice feminist dialogue is in our culture today. Finally, reform of society. I think so, and we have a couple concrete things there, especially like that sexual harassment. There's a clear reform of society making it a better place. So, all right, good deal. Hope you all enjoyed these. See y'all later.